Here with the good ones.
Any questions from anyone in the room? Yes.
Yeah, Mike, I really appreciated, enjoyed your presentation, about the food web and everything. Do you believe it can be broken down more in the habitats a little bit more, salinity gradients, or even into fresher environments, as far as that overall view of reaction and stresses due to oil, especially since you have so many pipelines that run interior.
Right. I think if you're looking at taking that approach and applying it to a system that's a little different, whether that's a system, whether it's the ecosystem that's different or the stressor system, then you might need to sort of evaluate and make some choices about the structure of the food web model in the same way. I think if this is, we were sort of focusing on a brackish marsh in Louisiana, but if you were to sort of have the greater marsh continuum, from a fresher to the brackish to the more saline marshes, then you'd have a larger suite of species in there and maybe different groups that aren't in there. So you'd have to change that food web structure. If you wanted to then have a larger scope to look at, say, salinity tolerance in your example. So I think it's very, very doable. We have a project with that's funded through the NOAA Restore Science program, where we're trying to look at some natural and created marshes, and we're doing some similar food web modeling efforts and looking at areas that have a siphon, an existing siphon, to try to look at that under a smaller scale. But I think it is quite adaptable. But I guess there's a saying that goes that all models are wrong, some models are useful, and so tailoring the model, tailoring the structure of the food web model and the way you're measuring sensitivity to a stressor, specifically to your project, will give it a much more powerful or meaningful output.
I had a question for Scott about the periwinkles and fiddler crabs. Do they move around a lot? Like, I know the periwinkles are snails, so they probably don't move around a whole lot, but you were talking about how there was more impacts further into the marsh. I'm just wondering, are these animals kind of moving away from the edge on purpose, or what are their movements, and how does that kind of play into what you're seeing out there?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, just kind of at its most basic level, I would think that fiddler crabs, for instance, are probably more mobile than periwinkles. And I think what I've read on periwinkles is they typically don't move over very large distances. So over a matter of weeks or months, they may only move like around an area about a few meters at most. I think when they're motivated by something like a contaminant or need to move to a food source, they actually can move longer distances quicker than you might think. But there's actually a different study that followed on the Nerdist study that I talked about, where they actually looked to see and did some mesocosm studies, and I helped a little bit with the design.
Brian?
The author's escaping me right now, but I can look it up for you. But they wanted to see if were the snails actually killed in these heavily oiled areas, or did they just move out of the area into less oiled areas? And they actually found that they weren't able to escape the oil, so they weren't moving out of the areas. And that's a pretty interesting paper, and I can refer you to that if you're interested.
Thank you.
If you go after a spill, right after a spill, you'll actually find the periwinkles scattered on the ground. So you can find the bodies, the shells that have been oiled.
And that was the case during deep water too, yeah, for sure. And mussels.
Yeah.
Linda, I had a question for you. You were talking about your different sampling techniques and determining that the sweeping technique was more effective at finding a number of species than the vacuuming technique. But what about species that are more cryptic? Like you're talking about the acrobat ants that are inside hollowed out parts. Like, how do you effectively sample something that's cryptic and not easily swept?
Yeah, so I glossed over that. So we did a lot of clip plots. So we clipped a quadrad. And this was in collaboration with Gene Turner. So he was looking at dead and alive plant, and I think the plants ended up getting analyzed for other things. But We then looked at who was on, so we put them in zippered pillowcases, and we used lights to try to push the ones that were on the outside of the out, and we cut open every stem. And so, yeah, so it's like basically in a, quarter meter square plot, who was there. And then, of course, collecting every organism we saw while we were clipping too. So it's basically collect everything. But it's very destructive, so we didn't do it very often. And also, the processing is super time consuming. And then we also realized, because we thought we were going to have a smaller suite of species, and also thought that they would be, we'd look on Bug Guide and they would be identified. We didn't know we were going to be sending these things across the world and people coming back and saying, we don't even know what this is. We don't even know what genus this is. It's new. So I'm completely buried.
Yeah.
But so we did things like that. We also looked at doing, you might have heard of malaise traps and some other things, but they all had to be things that could survive waves and storm surge and stuff if we were going to leave them out there. And he's laughing because we put emergence traps out and they would end up in the drink. And so, yeah, so we've played with how to, I don't think I know everything about it. I could work in the system for the rest of my life and still see new things.
Yeah, so it seems like there's still possibly some species that are being undersampled out there, and especially if you went from hypothesized 100 species to 250 or so species.
Yeah, and then another example is the other people who are now studying insects, is Lane Foyle and Claudia Husinator. They specifically focused on greenheads and deer flies and horse flies. And so they have a very aquatic larval stage, and then they're catching them in the way that you catch horse flies with these samplers. And just in their focus study, they're learning like new things and getting organisms that they typically haven't.
Anyone else?
All right. I will pose the same question that I asked our morning analysts. What sorts of ways are you all extending this information out to folks, either in their classrooms or in the community, or what ways can you see possible to do this, to extend that knowledge a little further?
I'll talk to anybody that listens to me. Most of the time I can't get people to listen to me, but I think outreach like this, we attend schools. We have somebody that is kind of heading up our outreach program, reaching out by word of mouth right now, and it's spreading, and we're doing schools and other events like Ocean Commotion and Earth Day, things like that. So we're trying to get the word out about just educating folks about spills, what, as the public, the general public, what not to do. Don't pour diesel on an ant pile. Don't, yeah. Yeah, and then
Groundwater.
I'm sure you've heard me say this before, but when we're out there studying after an oil spill, if an ant poops in my quad, I want to know about it. So, yeah.
I feel like this could be some sort of a meme, like an ant researcher and someone saying that. To me. Great, yeah.
So I've got one that I didn't really know about beforehand, but I don't even remember how I came across it. But there's a group called Environmental Science Journal for Kids that takes peer-reviewed research and basically translates it into different age groups and then republishes it. And it's open access, but it's actually an actual journal that they use in schools. And then they did that with our fiddler crab paper. It converted it and did a bunch of artwork and cool graphics. And then they also do a teacher's guide that goes with it. And then it can be used in schools and stuff. But I even found it, I thought it was valuable for me to see, research in more layperson terms.
Yeah.
And that's a really good group to work with.
Yeah, that sounds like an excellent resource for teachers, if there are any teachers or folks in here who work with teachers.
Or homeschoolers.
Yeah, or homeschoolers, that's true.
I want that.
So I have a couple things. So related to, I guess, that going into classrooms, I get requests because insects are not considered animals. for science fair projects, so I've guided some high school science fair projects. And then also I have this big Facebook page that I put tidbits out. I've written letters to the editor, op-eds actually, New York Times. And then I think my students might be really tired of me talking about the oil spill in my class. Because I teach intro to environmental science, so it's very multidisciplinary. So we can talk about policy, we can talk about, so it's just, I think it's like infiltrated all my teaching. I was teaching conservation biology when the oil spill happened, so I was like, oh, well, you know. So I use it, always use it as an example.
Well, with that, unless there are further questions or if anyone else wants to add something to that, I'm going to ask we thank our guest speakers up here and also just in the room. And then after thunderous applause for all of them for a great job, I'd love to get everyone up at the front of the room to take a group photo of everyone, if that's all right. So, okay, no more questions?